Welcome to Cut to the Chase, where we talk about compelling legal, regulatory, and public interest information and news. Your host is Gregg Goldfarb, an attorney, entrepreneur, investor, and activist.
Okay, folks, it's time for our favorite podcast, Cut to the Chase. And I know that it is so hot. It's just so hot. Oh my God. You know, from what I've been told, going out on the beach in the Atlantic Ocean, it's like bathwater. And, you know, La Niña, now we're in El Nino. Is the Gulf Stream going to collapse? I got a lot of questions. So I was just walking down the street. This is really keeping me up. And I ran into my favorite meteorologist, Andrew Hagen from National Hurricane Center, who's here to explain all these things to us. What's going on, Andrew? How you doing?
Well, I'm great. Thanks for asking, Greg. And you're exactly right. The Atlantic has record warm sea surface temperatures this summer. And, even as of the end of July, which was last month, the sea surface temperatures were already as warm as the previous record year at the end of August. And the end of August is typically when we see our warmest water temperatures, because usually they keep warming through all the way till the end of the summer. And so when we look at those numbers at the end of August, right now, the sea surface temperatures are by far the warmest they've ever been, warmer than the previous year when you average over the whole Atlantic Ocean.
All right. So what about, before we get into the nuts and bolts of this discussion, what about the hurricane activity for the year? How are we doing so far?
Yeah, so far, hurricane activity in the Atlantic Basin's been above average in terms of named storms. We just had our second hurricane of the year because we had Franklin that strengthened to a hurricane that's going to be headed west of Bermuda in about 3 or 4 days from now. Around the 1st of September, it should pass to the west of Bermuda. So overall activity has been just a little bit above average. Now, in terms of the predictions for the remainder of the Atlantic hurricane season, there's two competing factors. One is that we're in a moderate El Nino. So El Nino increases the wind shear of the Atlantic. Typically, there's fewer storms during an El Nino, but the competing factor is that we have record warm ocean temperatures in the Atlantic. And the warmer the water, the more active the hurricane season is likely to be. So those two competing factors are giving some uncertainty on exactly how strong, how many storms and how many hurricanes we're going to have in the Atlantic this year.
All right. And you also, before we got on the program today, a little initial preparation, you told me about the Antarctic ice and that it was at its lowest ever.
Yes. The last time I looked, which was at the end of July, beginning of August, which is the winter time in Antarctica, the sea ice surrounding Antarctica was at its lowest level on record, and it wasn't even close. It's not like it was just a little lower than the second place year. It was several standard deviations lower than the next year.
So what is it exactly that you looked at to make that determination? Is there a website or just some information?
Well, so yeah, there was a scientist. The scientist that monitored that, shared that information with the rest of the meteorology and climatology community. I don't regularly look at that information, but it is a number that's just very interesting. I mean, there were a lot of anomalies that occurred in July, and really this summer has been one of the hottest on record for many areas of the world, including portions of Florida had the hottest July on record.
All right. So I guess the moral of the story is it's not even August. So August, it is August, but the information you're getting is from July up through July.
Right.
Yeah. All right. So I hate to see where we're going next with, now that August is ending, but the last time we actually did a podcast, we were in La Niña and now we're in El Nino. So just give us a little refresher, what is El Nino versus La Nina? Where does it start? How does it start? And all that kind of stuff.
So it has to do with El Nino has to do with the warming of water in the equatorial Eastern Pacific Ocean, which is caused by a variety of factors. But once you have that warming in the eastern part of the East Pacific, which is off the coast of northern South America and the Pacific Ocean, then you have an El Nino. And that, water temperatures in one part of the world, you'd be surprised at how much that modulates the weather in far stretches of the earth. Now, exactly the opposite side of the world from there, El Nino only has a little bit of an impact. The closer you are to that area of the East Pacific, so really all of the United States, like all of the Pacific and the Atlantic, As long as you're like within 1/3 of the Earth from that area, it has a big effect on those areas. And the biggest effect comes in the wintertime. So the predictions are that the El Nino will continue through the upcoming winter. That and that makes it a little bit cooler and drier in South Florida, for example. But in other parts of the country, it makes it wetter and warmer.
All right. So the ice, Antarctic, I know we talked about before the show, what your observations, one of the things you told me was in the Antarctic ice sheets were at their lowest of all time, or at least in the recorded time.
Yes, that's right. Since record keeping has begun of Arctic ice sheets, which I know they've been doing it for at least 60 or 70 years, this July and early August, by far, it's the lowest amount of sea ice that surrounds the ocean surrounding Antarctica is usually covered by sea ice in the winter, their winter, which is our summer here. And it's by far the lowest amount of sea ice on record in 2023. A few standard deviations lower than even the second place year, the previous record, which is really crazy.
Wow. Okay. All right. So the last time you did a show before, and when we did that show, we were in La Nina, and now we're in El Nino. So like, what is I mean, give us a refresher course. What is La Nina? Where does it come from? El Nino, and how does it affect the whole planet? Does it affect just the area that it's generated from?
Yeah, so when we were in the La Nina, the water temperatures in the Pacific Ocean offshore of South America were cooler than normal. And El Nino is when the water temperatures in that area are warmer than normal. And that affects the weather patterns across a large portion of the Earth, including in the United States, South America, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean. In some parts of the United States, it makes it warmer and wetter than normal. In other areas, it's cooler and drier than normal. So it produces weather patterns that are atypical in a stronger El Nino and also in a stronger La Nina, but the opposite type of weather pattern.
All right. So we're talking about the Pacific being the factor that's controlling El Nino and La Nina.
Hmm.
And I mean, when I was growing up, I never even heard of these El Nino, La Nina, whatever. Maybe just in a Spanish vocabulary setting, but um, are we going like, is it like one or the other? We're either in El Nino or La Nina, or like, how does this play out? Is there something in between where
Yeah,
you're in
so
neither case
so there's
situation?
there's there's a La Nina neutral and El Nino depending on the water temperatures in the Eastern Pacific. So sometimes we're in between the two in neutral phase. And but a lot of times what we've seen is directly following a moderate to strong El Nino. A lot of times we go back into the La Nina 1 or 2 years later. And so typically, we get a moderate or stronger El Nino like every 4 to 7 years, and, it just changes the weather patterns that you'll have for that winter. I mean, most of all, you'll see these changes most pronounced during the winter time, but it also affects some types of weather during the summer too, including tropical cyclone activity in certain parts of the world. Like in the Western Pacific, where you have the most typhoons out closer to Asia, it doesn't change the number, but it changes where they form further east. And so less of those storms go toward China and more of them turn east. And in the Atlantic, El Nino decreases the number of hurricanes and major hurricanes. In the Eastern Pacific, it increases the activity.
All right. So sticking with the Pacific body of water, the Pacific Ocean, I wanted to just throw a curveball in, which is all right. We were the hurricane in California. I know it turned out not to be a hurricane by the time it reached land, but I was under the impression that you don't have hurricanes out in the Pacific. You have cyclones and you have hurricanes out in the Atlantic, and all that. So where am I wrong?
So,
Where am I off?
all the storms are just a different name for what you call a tropical cyclone. A hurricane is in the Atlantic and the East Pacific. We also call them hurricanes once they reach 74 miles an hour, but below that tropical storm, of course. And so once you reach the international date line to the west of Hawaii, then they're called typhoons. But they're called hurricanes all the way up to until you get past Hawaii to the international date line.
All right, now let's shift over to the Atlantic coast. And I'm reading in the papers that the Gulf Stream might collapse, might collapse next year. It's not going to collapse next year. But let's discuss what that theory is. But before we get into that, like, what is the Gulf Stream? I know when I'm reading this information, they talk there's an acronym AMOC. I never heard of that. So tell us about what that stream is, what it does, what is AMOC, and then we can go into the theory behind why it's going to collapse.
So AMOC stands for Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, and the Gulf Stream, which a lot of us are familiar with, which is the current of warm water that goes off of Florida and goes up the whole East Coast and even in the North Atlantic and all the way to Europe. The Gulf Stream is part of the AMOC, and basically the AMOC is a three-dimensional current of water that's rich with nutrients, and it flows in the upper portion of the ocean, like the upper 2,000 feet of the ocean, closer to the surface. That's why it's a warm current, closer to the U.S. But then once it gets to Greenland, and it gets closer to Europe, it sinks down to the lower part of the ocean, and that current part of the AMOC, it travels down in the lower 2,000 feet of the ocean, as it comes back. Across like south of Africa and like which there's really a whole network of currents that go across the whole earth, not just the Atlantic. And so there's a current that goes south of South America and south of South Africa and goes around the Indian Ocean. But it's just um, you know, the water sinks and it upwells in various parts of the ocean. And so when you have an upwelling, that brings cooler water to the surface. But when you have a sinking, that brings warmer water a little bit down lower.
Okay, so what is the theory in terms of the collapse? And, how long have they been looking into, this current?
Well, the thought is that when you have global warming, you have more of the Greenland ice caps melting, and that's one of the areas near that's important for this overturning circulation to continue. And so, if you increase the melting, you'll have more fresh water, and the salinity is also something that's important to this circulation, in addition to the temperature of the water. And so, there have already been observations since they started making observations that this circulation has slowed down a little bit, just a tiny bit so far. And some people think that it's going to slow down a lot more and it's going to completely collapse within the next couple decades. There was even a report in the newspapers about it collapsing by 2025. I think it's not going to happen by 2025, but it could slow down a little bit more. I think the theory is well founded that um, if enough of the Greenland ice cap melts, it could slow down by a decent amount over the next 25 years or so. And could this produce a long-term cooling effect for Europe? If this overturning circulation stops, it could produce a little bit of cooling for Europe. But I think these theories, scientists are not really agreeing on this right now. Like there's a lot of debate on this, and there's really only a small to a decent amount of scientists. I think there's not really a large amount of scientists are on board with this just yet. I think we need more observations for another 5 or 10 years, see what happens with the circulation before we come to any more firm conclusions.
Okay, all right. So final question. I mean, I'm full and fair disclosure. I'm, completely, buying into the fact that the planet, the people on the planet are causing the planet to warm up with global warming. I mean, I know that people call it climate change, but to me, global warming, I think, is actually more accurate in terms of the concept. But let me, and it's so hot. I think even people that were denying the science behind this now are like, well, maybe I'm not right. Something is wrong here. But going back to El Nino, this is gonna be my last question. Tell me whether you agree with this or not. Is El Nino making it feel hotter right now?
In certain places on Earth, like I said, during El Nino, some places are warmer and other places El Nino makes it cooler. So, because, there's just like a redistribution of heat and moisture in different areas of the Earth. El Nino, it really is more of a natural cycle that's not really caused by humans. Like El Nino was here long before humans started influencing the climate. Uh, Now, could the human activity like change the frequency of El Nino or make them stronger? Like possible, and there are some scientists working on studies in that area, but there's nothing proven yet that global warming or climate change is causing El Niños to be more frequent or less frequent. There's definitely a lot of debate there, but it is an active area of research.
All right. And I look forward to seeing updates. And, when I run into you on the street, I have more questions. I will bring you on here, whether you want to or not, to address these issues. So Andrew Hagen from the National Hurricane Center, my favorite meteorologist, quickly becoming a regular contributor on this show. That'll do it for this episode of Cut to the Chase, everybody. Stay safe, stay cool, stay warm, whatever you need to do to stay happy, all right? Take care.
That's all for this episode of Cut to the Chase. But before you go, will you open up your podcast app and give us a 5-star review? You can also leave a comment about what you liked most or other topics you'd like us to cover. And please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming shows. Thanks, everybody. Be safe out there.